I thought it was just a harmless joke. But that one comment destroyed my marriage. And I lost everything I ever loved.
I only joked about my husband's size once. But when I looked up, I realized I had just burned down my own life. It was a Sunday dinner, nothing special. Just the usual crowd, Sarah, Mike, Rachel, Tom, and a few others from our old college group. We'd been doing these dinners for years. Rotating houses, drinking too much wine, talking about everything and nothing. That night was at our place, and by 9 o'clock, everyone was pleasantly tipsy. The conversation had drifted to relationships, as it always did when we'd had enough to drink. Sarah was complaining about Mike leaving dishes in the sink, and I jumped in saying that at least Mike remembered to rinse them first. Mike laughed and said he wasn't that bad, was he? Sarah rolled her eyes, and said he was worse. That last week, he'd left a pan soaking for 3 days, until it started growing something green. Tom chimed in about his wife never remembering to lock the front door. He said he'd come home twice last month, to find it wide open. And one time, their neighbor's cat had made itself at home on their couch. His wife, Jenny, protested that she'd only forgotten twice, maybe 3 times. Tom said it was more like 5 times. But who was counting? Everyone laughed. Rachel started telling us about how her husband, Dave, had tried to fix their garbage disposal himself, and had somehow made it worse. She said the kitchen had flooded, and Dave had stood there with a wrench, looking completely defeated. Dave shook his head and said he'd saved them $200 in repair costs. Thank you very much. Rachel said the cleanup had cost them $300 in damaged flooring. That's when the conversation turned to my marriage. Sarah asked how Nick and I were doing, and I said we were fine. Though I'd had to have another talk with him about the iron. I explained that he kept leaving it on after using it, and I told him if he forgot one more time, I was going to buy myself something that wasn't just warmer, but more effective too. Everyone was listening, waiting for the punchline, so I delivered it. I said that finding something his size would be tricky though. Maybe I'd have to shop in the children's section. I expected the usual laughter, the knowing looks, maybe Sarah making a comment about men and their egos, but instead, the room went dead quiet. I looked around the table, confused by their faces. Mike was staring at his wine glass. Rachel looked like she'd been slapped. Tom was clearing his throat uncomfortably. That's when I noticed Nick's chair was empty. He'd put down his napkin and walked out without a word. I looked at Sarah and asked where he'd gone. She said quietly that he'd just left. I asked if anyone knew why, saying it was just a joke. But nobody answered. Nobody even looked at me. The silence stretched on forever. Finally, I laughed nervously and asked what was wrong with everyone, telling them it was obviously a joke. Sarah said maybe some jokes weren't funny. I asked her what she meant by that. She said that maybe making fun of my husband's body in front of all our friends wasn't the kind of humor she found amusing. I felt my face getting hot. I told Sarah that she was being ridiculous, that Nick and I joked about each other all the time. Rachel spoke up then, saying that she'd never heard Nick make jokes about me. I said that was because he wasn't as funny as I was, which got another uncomfortable silence. Mike suggested maybe we should call it a night. I protested that it was only 9:30, but people were already standing up, gathering their jackets. Rachel gave me a hug that felt stiff and formal. She said she hoped everything would be okay. I told her everything was fine, that Nick was just being sensitive. After everyone left, and they left quickly with those awkward hugs that barely touched my shoulders, I sat at my computer and wrote Nick an email. I was furious. I told him he was being ridiculous, that it was pathetic to storm out over one little joke. I wrote that this wasn't a real marriage, if we couldn't laugh at each other. I said that maybe if he wasn't so sensitive about everything, we wouldn't have these problems. I told him that our friends probably thought he was being childish, and that I was embarrassed by his behavior. I sent it before I could think twice. The next morning brought no response. Just silence from his end of the house. He'd slept in the guest room, and by the time I got up, he was already gone for work. I found a note on the kitchen counter saying he'd be staying at his brother's for a few days to think things through. I crumpled it up and threw it away. I spent the day replaying the dinner, but not in the way you might think. I wasn't questioning myself. I was getting angrier. I called my sister Linda to vent. I told her what had happened, expecting support. Instead, Linda was quiet for a long time before asking if I really thought what I'd said was appropriate. I asked her whose side she was on. She said she wasn't taking sides, but that she could understand why Nick was hurt. I hung up on her. That evening, I tried texting Nick. I wrote that I missed him and asked when he was coming home. No response. I texted again, saying we needed to talk like adults. Still nothing. Finally, I called his brother Paul's house. Paul answered and said Nick didn't want to talk to me right now. I asked Paul what Nick had told him. Paul said that Nick had told him enough. I demanded to know what that meant. Paul said that maybe I should think about how I spoke about my husband. And then he hung up. That night, lying in bed alone, something shifted. Maybe it was the wine wearing off, or maybe it was the complete silence of the house. But I started remembering other moments. Other jokes I'd made about Nick over the years. I remembered his mother's birthday party last year. We'd been sitting around their dining room table, and Nick's dad had been telling a story about trying to install a new light fixture in their garden. I jumped in with my own story about how Nick had nearly drowned himself in his parents' decorative fountain, trying to change a similar light bulb. I'd said that intelligence wasn't exactly his strong suit, but at least he was enthusiastic about helping. Everyone had laughed, including Nick's parents. His mother had said that all men were hopeless with home repairs. His father had agreed, chuckling about his own mishaps. But now I could picture Nick's face more clearly. The way he'd smiled along, but how the smile hadn't reached his eyes. How he'd been quiet for the rest of the evening. How he'd barely spoken to me on the drive home. Then I remembered what I'd told Rachel a few months ago. During one of our coffee dates, she'd been complaining about her husband's lack of romance. How Dave never surprised her anymore. I'd chimed in about how being with Nick was like being with a brother. Everything was familiar, but absolutely nothing was exciting anymore. I'd said that the spark had died years ago. That I sometimes wondered what it would be like to be with someone who actually made my heart race. Rachel had looked uncomfortable and had changed the subject quickly. She'd asked if Nick knew I felt that way. I'd laughed and said that Nick was oblivious to most things, so probably not. Rachel had said that maybe I should talk to him about it instead of talking to her. I'd said there was no point, that Nick wouldn't understand anyway. And there was that time at my office Christmas party, when I'd been talking to my coworkers about holiday stress. My colleague Janet had been complaining about her husband's inability to help with the holiday preparations. I topped her story by telling everyone about how Nick still couldn't fold towels properly after 15 years of marriage. I'd joked that if he ever died, it would probably be from embarrassment when everyone discovered he'd been living like a college freshman his whole adult life. Everyone had laughed, but I'd noticed how they looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching. My boss had changed the subject pretty quickly after that. For a moment, lying there in the dark, I wondered if maybe I had been too harsh, but I pushed the thought away quickly. These were just jokes. Everyone makes jokes about their spouses. That's what marriage is, finding humor in each other's flaws. If Nick couldn't handle a little teasing, that was his problem, not mine. The next day, I called Rachel, needing someone to tell me I was right. I asked her to be honest with me, to tell me if I'd really been that cruel at dinner. I said I needed her to be straight with me, because everyone was acting like I'd committed some terrible crime. Rachel was quiet for a long time before she answered. I could hear her sighing on the other end of the line. Finally, she said she had something to tell me that I wasn't going to like. She said she'd called Nick the day after the dinner. I asked her why she'd done that. She said she'd felt like she needed to apologize to him. I asked her what she meant. Rachel said she'd told Nick that she was sorry for all the times she'd listened to me complain about him without saying anything. She said she'd told him about our coffee conversations, about the things I'd said about our marriage, about how I'd described him to other people. She said she'd done it because I'd been putting him down for so long, and someone needed to stand up for him. I exploded. I told her she'd betrayed me, that she was supposed to be my friend. How could she go behind my back like that? I said I'd trusted her with private thoughts, and she'd weaponized them against me. I asked her if she had any idea what she'd done to my marriage. Rachel's voice was calm when she replied. She said she'd been protecting me for years, covering for me, making excuses for my comments. She said that whenever people asked her about my marriage, she'd change the subject or defend me. But she couldn't do it anymore. She said she was tired of watching me tear down a good man, just because I could. I asked her what she meant by that. Rachel said that Nick was kind, that he was loyal, that he'd never said a single negative word about me in all the years she'd known us. She said that when she'd called him, he hadn't even been angry. He'd been heartbroken. She said he told her that he'd known for years that I didn't respect him, but hearing it confirmed had been devastating. I told Rachel that she didn't understand our dynamic, that Nick and I had our own way of communicating. She said that what I called communication looked a lot like emotional abuse from the outside. I said that was ridiculous, that I'd never abused anyone. Rachel said that words could be just as damaging as physical violence, and that I'd been using mine as weapons for years. The call ended with me hanging up on her. Over the next few days, I tried reaching out to other friends from our group. I called Sarah and asked if she wanted to grab lunch. Sarah said she was busy. I asked when she'd be free. She said she'd have to check her schedule and get back to me. Pause. She never did. I texted Mike asking if he wanted to meet for drinks after work. He responded hours later saying he had plans. I asked what kind of plans. He said family stuff. I pointed out that he'd never had family stuff on weeknights before. He didn't respond. I called Tom and asked if he knew what was going on with everyone. Tom was uncomfortable on the phone. He said that people were just processing what had happened at dinner. I asked him what there was to process. He said that maybe I should talk to Nick instead of calling everyone else. I said Nick wasn't talking to me. Tom said maybe there was a reason for that. A week later, I decided to join the group for lunch at our usual restaurant downtown. I hadn't been invited, but I figured they'd just forgotten to call me. These things happened, and I wasn't going to let one awkward dinner destroy friendships I'd had for over a decade. But when I walked in and saw them all sitting around our regular table, I realized it wasn't an accident. They'd planned this lunch without me. The hostess led me over to their table, and I could see the surprise on their faces. When they saw me approaching, I sat down in the empty chair and acted like nothing was wrong. I said it was good to see everyone, and asked how their week had been. The responses were polite but distant. Sarah said her week had been fine. Mike nodded and said same here. Rachel was looking at her menu like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. That's when I noticed Nick wasn't alone. There was a woman sitting next to him, someone I recognized as a teacher from the local elementary school. She was pretty in a quiet way, with kind eyes and a soft voice. When she spoke to Nick, asking if he'd decided what to order, he actually smiled, really smiled. The kind of smile I hadn't seen from him in years. I asked Nick who his friend was. He introduced her as Emma, saying she taught 3rd grade at Jefferson Elementary. Emma smiled and said she'd heard so much about everyone. I asked Nick how they'd met. Emma answered instead, saying they'd met at a coffee shop near the school where she worked. She said Nick had been reading a book she'd recommended to her students, and they'd started talking about children's literature. I made some comment about Nick never reading children's books when we were together. Emma looked confused and said that Nick seemed to read quite a bit. She said they'd had several conversations about books over the past few weeks. Nick said quietly that he'd always enjoyed reading. He just hadn't had much opportunity to discuss books at home. The conversation felt stilted and awkward. I tried to slip back into the old dynamic, making a light comment about the weather and how everyone seemed to be taking global warming personally these days. A few people smiled politely, but no one laughed. The energy was completely different from our usual lunches. I decided to try a different approach. I asked Emma what she thought of Nick's cooking, saying that he'd probably made her his famous spaghetti by now. Emma said that actually Nick was an excellent cook, and that he'd made her a beautiful dinner the previous weekend. She described the meal in detail. Herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables, and homemade bread. I was stunned. I told Emma that Nick had never cooked like that for me. Emma looked uncomfortable and said maybe he'd learned some new recipes recently. Nick said quietly that he'd always enjoyed cooking, but he'd stopped making elaborate meals because I'd usually had something to say about his technique, or his choice of ingredients. I felt my face getting hot. I asked Nick what he meant by that. He said that I'd often criticized his cooking, pointing out what he'd done wrong, or suggesting how he could have done it better. I said I'd only been trying to help him improve. Nick said it hadn't felt like help. The table went quiet again. Sarah suggested maybe we should order, and everyone buried themselves in their menus. When the waitress came over, Emma ordered a salad and said she wasn't very hungry. Nick ordered the same thing. I ordered a full meal, appetizer, entree, dessert. Partly out of defiance, and partly because I was stress eating. During the meal, I tried to make conversation several more times. I asked Tom about his new job, but his answers were brief, and he didn't elaborate the way he usually did. I asked Rachel about her kids, but she gave me basic updates, without the funny stories she usually shared. Mike barely spoke at all. Finally, I made a joke about the restaurant's new menu, saying that they'd obviously hired a chef who thought parsley was a main course. It was the kind of harmless comment that usually got at least a chuckle from someone. But the table went silent again. Sarah set down her fork and looked at me directly. She said that maybe some things were better left unsaid. I asked her what she meant. Sarah said that not every thought needed to be voiced, especially if it was going to make someone feel bad. I asked who I was making feel bad. Sarah glanced around the table and said that mean comments had a way of making everyone uncomfortable. I stood up then, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I told them all to enjoy their lunch and their new dynamic. I said it was clear I wasn't welcome anymore, and I wasn't going to sit there and be lectured about my sense of humor. Nick called my name softly as I walked away, but I didn't turn around. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and cried. But I wasn't crying from sadness. I was crying from rage. How had I become the villain in this story? How had Nick managed to turn all our friends against me? How was I the bad guy when all I'd ever done was speak the truth? 2 weeks later, the divorce papers arrived in the mail. I stared at them for a long time, not quite believing what I was seeing. We'd been separated for less than a month, and he was already filing for divorce. The papers cited irreconcilable differences, which felt like our differences weren't irreconcilable. They just required Nick to grow a thicker skin. I called Nick immediately, but he didn't answer. His voicemail message was different now, shorter, more formal. I left a message asking him to call me back, saying we needed to discuss this like adults. He didn't call back, so I wrote him another email. Longer this time. I told him he was being dramatic, that every marriage had rough patches, and that divorce was an extreme overreaction to one bad night. I said that if he couldn't handle a little honesty in a marriage, maybe he wasn't mature enough to be married at all. I told him that I'd only ever spoken the truth about things, and if he found the truth insulting, that was his problem to solve. I also wrote that I thought his new girlfriend was probably just being nice to him, because she didn't know him well enough yet. I said that once the novelty wore off, she'd start to see the same flaws I'd been pointing out for years. I told him that running away to someone new wasn't going to change who he was fundamentally. His response came back within an hour. It was just 2 lines. I'm not a victim, Ellie. I got tired of being your punchline. For the first time in weeks, I didn't write back immediately. Something about those words hit differently than everything else he'd said or written. I kept reading them over and over, trying to understand what he meant. I'd never thought of him as my punchline. I'd thought of him as my husband, my partner, my what? What had I thought of him as? I started going through old photos on my phone, looking at pictures of us over the years. In the early photos, we looked happy. Nick's smiles were genuine. His arm around me was confident. But as I scrolled through the years, I could see something changing. His smiles became more forced. His posture became more defensive. In the most recent photos, he looked like he was bracing himself for something. A few days later, my mother came to visit. She'd heard about the separation through the family grapevine, and wanted to check on me. I made tea and we sat in the kitchen, like we had when I was a child. I expected sympathy, or at least understanding. I told her about the dinner, about Nick's overreaction, about how all our friends had turned against me. My mother listened quietly, sipping her tea and nodding occasionally. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she set down her cup and said something that cut deeper than anything Nick or Rachel had said. She said it hurt her to say it, but that even my father hadn't been able to handle me sometimes. I asked her what she meant by that. She said that I'd always had a sharp tongue, even as a child, and that I'd never learned when to keep my observations to myself. I protested that I was just honest, that I said what other people were thinking, but were too polite to voice. My mother said that wasn't honesty. It was cruelty disguised as truth. She said that honest people found ways to be truthful without being hurtful, but that I'd never learned that skill. I asked her why she was taking everyone else's side. She said she wasn't taking sides, but that she'd watched me do this my whole life. She said I didn't listen to people. Didn't hear them when they tried to tell me I'd hurt them. She said I dismissed their feelings and made them feel small. And that eventually everyone got tired of being treated that way. I stood up so fast, my chair fell over. I was shaking with anger as I told her to get out. I said if that's what she really thought of me, she could leave right now and never come back. I told her that I didn't need people in my life who were going to judge me and make me feel terrible about myself. My mother stood up slowly and gathered her purse. She said she loved me, but that she'd been enabling my behavior for too long by not calling it out. She said that maybe losing everything would be the wake-up call I needed. I told her to get out again. Louder this time, at the door. She turned back and said that she hoped I'd figure out how to be kinder to people before I ended up completely alone. She said that my father had tried to teach me empathy when I was young, but that I'd been too stubborn to learn. She said it wasn't too late, but that I had to want to change. I slammed the door behind her and turned the deadbolt. The silence in the house was complete now. No TV, no music, no conversation. Just me and the sound of my own breathing. I'd always been uncomfortable with silence, always felt the need to fill it with words, with jokes, with observations. But now I was forced to sit with it, to let it teach me what I'd been too busy talking to learn. I whispered into the empty room, maybe I really am a terrible person. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, no one was there to argue with me, or agree with me, or laugh at what I'd said.